everyone. Welcome to this special feature interview for KCrushAmericaMagazine. I'm your host, film critic and journalist Carolyn Hinds, and today I am very happy to be joined by filmmaker, actress, professor, playwright Keira Loughran to talk about her documentary Exclusion Beyond the Silence, which is a documentary premiering at the 2024 Real Asian International Film Festival. So this film is about I guess you can say the familial and psychological impact of what is known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And for those who don't know, the Chinese Exclusion Act was a law, an immigration law, that was passed in Canada between 1923 till 1947, which incidentally, I was doing some other research, was around the same time it was repealed in America, because America had its own Chinese Exclusion Act, but they're starting in around like 1880, around that time. So North America has been doing its thing. So the film really talks about how the Exclusion Act came to be, about activists like Jean Lum, who was the first Chinese Canadian woman or person who received the Order of Canada, which is a very high merit in Canadian politics and society, and just about finding your roots and your history, like going all the way back to Guangzhou and in China, and just like discovering the close connection you and another lady, Helen Lee, had together. But we're going to get into that. But first of all, thank you so much, Keira, for joining me to talk about the film.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I have to ask. So as I mentioned, you're an actress, you're a playwright, you're a professor. How did you decide to become a filmmaker? Like that's so you have so much going on. You're just like, I'm going to take on another challenge. I'm going to become a filmmaker, but I'm not just going to do a regular film. I'm going to make a documentary about the Chinese Exclusion Act and Canadian history.
Yeah, it actually, I know it sounds really weird, but it actually happened quite organically, which I would say is true of my professional life in general. So I've been working for over 25 years in theater, and I was lucky enough that I was able to do that professionally. So starting as an actor, and then I moved pretty quickly into, I was part of a lot of original Canadian plays, new Canadian plays, which is kind of the bread and butter of professional theater actors in Canada. Most of our funding goes there and all of that. And I started in Toronto, which is where I was from, and grew up at a time when they were just starting the whole question of inclusion of diversity and diverse voices. So my playwriting came about mostly because there was beginning to be encouragement for artists of color, to sort of go, well, what stories do you want to tell? But I'm also of a generation where it's like, well, you don't get to tell me what stories I want to tell. I want to tell the stories I want to tell. And so that took me, I wrote my first play in 2002. It was called Little Dragon, and it was about a girl. It was like a coming-of-age story about a girl who thinks she's the long-lost daughter of Bruce Lee.
Who wouldn't want to think that, right?
And we did it at the Summer Works Festival in Toronto, and then it got picked up by Theatre Passe Muraille, and it was a really, it felt like a bit of a calling card, or a way that I was able to enter into that community as a maker, a theater maker, storyteller, and then that actually ended up being involved in sort of facilitating other people being able to make their plays too. So it took me into directing and producing, often within or working with artists from marginalized communities, women or people of color, in any kind of capacity, to help birth a bunch of new plays that would contribute to the growing Canadian theater ecology. And eventually found myself working as the associate producer for dramaturgy and new plays, and then the lab and the forum at the Stratford Festival of Canada, which is like the largest theater company in Canada, which is mostly focused on the works of William Shakespeare at the center of their mandate, but does a season of like 10 plus shows a year. And what I was recruited to do there, was to challenge and question and expand what the company would work on with an eye to diversity. So bringing contemporary living playwrights back into the season, artists of color into the season, on stage, backstage, and I get a lot of pleasure and community through doing that work. Within that time, I was sometimes writing, I was often directing, so that became my primary way of storytelling was directing actors, sometimes writing or contributing to writing, or being a dramaturg to bring these productions to life. And after doing that in the office at the festival, and I was directing some plays at the festival, it was a lot of work. Was able to start a family, and I wanted to return to my own artistic project. It had been a while, so I left the office job and started to look back into my family history, which does sort of stem to for the story that was known to me at the time with my grandparents. So as you said, my grandmother was Jean Lum, and she was born in 1919 in Canada. My other grandmother on my mom's side was also born in Canada. And I've had a lot of pride as a Canadian growing up. I felt very confident to say I'm Canadian because my family had been here for 3+ generations. And my grandfathers were both from China, didn't know much about them. And so I started to look into that period of when they first came over, which was in 1921, and then discovered that it was this period of exclusion, became more aware of the Exclusion Act, which I knew about before, but I hadn't really thought about very much. When we talked about discrimination against Chinese people in that legislation, we kind of lumped the head tax together with the Exclusion Act and sort of branded it as a general, like, they controlled immigration of Chinese people and limited it because they didn't want us here. And it was a sort of general wash of history. So I just started to dig into it a little more. And then the pandemic happened. And the theaters shut down. And I was like, well, there were two things. One was, the stories that I was digging into. First of all, I was finding connections with other generational Chinese of my generation. They were all over the place. They were across Canada. And my own family originally, like both my grandmothers were born in British Columbia. So I knew that the people who would relate to these stories on that level were all over the country. And there was no way if I made a play that they would actually be able to see it. And so then I started to think about, well, maybe we do this digital thing. And then when the pandemic hit and shut all the theaters down, it became even more of an impetus to try to do that. So I got a couple of grants to be able to start to storytell in digital mediums through editing, shooting on my iPhones, really like guerrilla style, working with colleagues, opening up and exploring this research in performative ways. So that's how that started. This particular project was actually gifted to me by my producer, Craig Thompson, and Ballon Rand Entertainment. So Craig is a local to Stratford, which is where I live now, filmmaker and film producing company. And he saw, at the start of the pandemic, a death notice for a woman named Foon Hey Lam. She was 111 years old. She was one of the first Canadians to die from COVID-19. She was living in the Monchong Home for the Aged, which is a Chinese nursing home in Toronto that I was aware of. And she was separated from her family because of the COVID protocols. And I first heard about it through her granddaughter, who was talking about her grandmother's story, and found out that her grandmother had been separated from her grandfather during that period of exclusion for upwards of 30 years. Craig had optioned the rights to the story and was like, would you like to direct it? It's very rare for an artist to be asked, in my experience, to have a producer go, hey, do you want to do this thing? And I had worked on a few other projects with him, but I was like, yes, I would love to do that. And I said, the thing that interests me is the awareness of the capacity through this woman's story for me to better understand what happened during that period of exclusion for women. And then the other side that I noticed was that we shared the same Chinese last name. And it's probably more out of ignorance than anything else, but I did know that my Chinese last name, to my generation, was not as common as some of the other last names in Toronto. And so given that Foon Hey Lam had been in Toronto in that time, shared the same last name as my grandfather, that our families might have been closer than we knew or might realize. And so the investigation sort of started off with that, of like, are we close? How similar are our families, and how different are they? And in the exploration of that, how can we crack open this story of what happened to Chinese families during that period of exclusion through these two women, one in Canada, one in China, who were trying to make a future for their families within the culture, that the Chinese culture that was active at the time, which is people are going out, people are coming back, people are sending money, people are getting married, having children. It was a very sort of significant time in that history.
Yeah. But it kind of makes sense to me that it starts that way, because the pandemic, when lockdown happened, kind of gave people just a taste of that, of being separated from their families. Because I remember in 2021, lockdown was still happening, but I had to self-isolate because I had contracted COVID. And I was in self-isolation, locked away in my bedroom. I lived with my twin sister, but she wouldn't come into my bedroom. If I needed food or anything, she'd put it by the bedroom door, and I'd go out, get it, and come back in. But I remember I was covering Sundance Film Festival digitally. This was when the film industry was being so helpful and providing so many digital links for film critics, And the very, very first film that I saw for the year of 2021, and it was first film that I watched for the film festival, was a Chinese documentary. It's a Chinese-American co-production documentary. I believe the title is With Every Breath.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but I remember it had the word breath in it because, so the filmmaker was a Chinese-American filmmaker, and she was separated from her family in China. Her family just literally like 2 days before lockdown was officially called globally, only her husband and her son were able to go back to America while she was stuck in China. Yeah. So she took the opportunity, and because she was there doing research as well, and so while she was there, she started to do the research in Wuhan, on how the virus was said to first start in Wuhan. So she did this incredibly detailed research into going to ground zero in Wuhan, but then she expanded the film and the scope of the film to talk about immigration and exclusion and how all of these things, like you're separated from your family. And like talking about Anne Fuhe, she's separated from her family because of the pandemic, and then you were expanding the scope of that to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it shows like that's how the system works, like so much of government bureaucracy focuses on separating people, especially immigrants of color. Yeah, it happens so many times.
It happens so easily too, and people don't consider, I didn't even consider sort of the human cost of it in that way. And the other thing that was really ironic that I couldn't really ignore when Craig first brought the story to me, Funhe's story, was women of her generation or younger, because she was exceptionally senior, at that time also, if they weren't isolated in nursing homes and not able to talk to their family, if they did venture outside, they were being pushed, spat on, and being treated really horribly. And the irony, the unfairness of it, to treat older women in that way when you know nothing about the life that they've lived that's brought them to that point, and the racism and discrimination that they've survived in that period. It kind of cut, to be honest, and made the story urgent. And then what was kind of interesting was it's documentary. Craig is more of a documentary filmmaker himself. So in terms of the mentorship and in terms of the navigating those systems to actually make the film, it drew on my skills. A lot of my original work, I teach it here at York, is out of a tradition of theater that we call devised theater here. There's lots of different forms of it, but one of the forms is verbatim, site-specific, where basically capturing material that's based in based in real actual happenings, and then crafting the story from that, using verbatim text, and that's what I sort of explored within the digital projects, because I was trying to find a way for film to be able to hold the stories, hold real stories, and that we don't need to say this is fictional and we don't need to say this is absolutely true. That we can actually craft a narrative that speaks to a broader demographic by basing our stories in documentary filming and understanding the subjectivity in that and the craft in bringing and in editing really to try to bring those stories, those threads of reality together in a new way that creates, I guess, more of like a dramatic narrative through. But it's all stuff that happened, and it's all like it's just that you've crafted it in such a way. So that's what my experience of making this film was we shot over the course of like 2 years. Right. I had met people that I knew I wanted to interview. I knew I wanted to talk to them about their like expertise in different areas of the history that I could draw on. We met people along the way, and I go, we need to do this. We should get so and so together with such and such, and just capture it. And then I had Iris Ng, my cinematographer, also Chinese, who'd never worked on a Chinese project before. Woman had gone to the same high school and elementary school as I did, so we sort of shared a common background. Be able to bring her expertise in film and documentary shooting to be able to have to collaborate with me and kind of go, well, what do what should I be looking at here? What do you see? And I could tell her what I was observing in my environment, and then she could capture it, and I could either go on camera or not, or I could watch. And so it was and that felt quite organic as well. And then even in the post-production, like watching the hours of footage and having experienced it because it was such a discovery along the way, like as an actor, allowing a camera to witness me within those moments, and then after watching it and then being able to see what felt like the right story and then what was captured of those moments, and then crafting a paper edit together of and scripting the voiceover. All of that felt very familiar in terms of what I do in creating some original pieces of theater.
Yeah, because you mentioned the word thread. I think that a thread is a word that I think would be probably a part of the tagline for this documentary, because in the film you reference the Red String of Fate, and it is Yuan Fan,
or Yuan Fan, depending which dialect you're speaking.
I before you had even mentioned it in the film, I'm like, she's talking about the Red String of Fate, and I know about the Red String of Fate because I watch a lot of Chinese films and dramas, and that features heavily in their romance and dramas. Like there is like the whole idea of predestination, and like you could meet someone once, like when you were 5 years old, and like 30 years down the line you're just gonna happen to meet this one person, and this is who you're gonna, because you're destined to meet them. Sometimes it does frustrate me in stories. I'm because you met as a child doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna end up marrying this person. Okay, it's frustrating sometimes, but in the film, like, it really does show, like, it does, like, this predestination, this idea of like you were destined to meet really shines through. From, like, for instance, you mentioned like you and Helen, like when you start to really dive into the background, like your families are literally from two sides of the same across the highway, right? And then like the ancestral gravestones are like across, like just up this, like you're like, hey, and that's like when you think about it, that's just like,
it's crazy. It's crazy.
And you're like, life is so strange. And like in China in particular, because China is like massive people, some of the biggest populations in the world. Like, what are the odds? And when I was really like, what are the odds? What are the chances? Not only from the same city or town, but literally like same burial plot. And I'm like, what are the odds of that? That kind of gets revealed later in the film, but it kind of ties in again to how you start the film, because I love how you start the film, because you start the film with it's in a restaurant, and I'm guessing that's a homage to your grandfather's restaurant, and like the service worker, he's clearing away the last meal of the day, and then he cleans it, puts on a fresh tablecloth, and he brings out the red paper to draw. I'm guessing couplets. Couplets are poems that he was creating, but then like he starts to put on these little pieces, and like you realize, oh, these are family heirlooms. These are family memorabilia. Pictures, passports, jewelry, all the things that we as future generations and present generations have left to remember older generations by. Like for me, here in Canada, the only thing that I have of my grandmother who died in Barbados is 2 pictures that we have displayed in our living room, and I think a brooch. Everything else that we have to remember my grandmother by is home in my family home back home with my mom. And like when you were placing when all those little things start to get placed in the film, I'm like, yes, the film is talking about politics, about the politics of the Chinese Exclusion Act. the politics of racism in Canada, of anti-Chinese racism globally, but especially in North America during the pandemic. But you're also thinking, to me, I also saw as you're talking about the effects of politics on family, you know, where like because of this thing that has happened, the only thing you have left of your family present are these heirlooms. And like when Helen Gold went back to her ancestral home, she was fortunate enough to still have an ancestral home to go back to, you know, and there's all of this beautiful woodwork, and she can't take it with her because it's attached to the house. So all she can do is take pictures of it, you know, and it's just like, and then you're thinking like she could have been there before, you know, she could have gone before, but she wasn't able to because what happened with the Chinese Exclusion Act is separated her grandmother from her grandfather, so there was no way to go back home, you know, there was no way for her grandmother died at 111 years old without ever being able to go back to China. And to me that was I think the film really does hit home with how racist immigration policies in particular shift paradigms for entire families and entire cultures, you know. And even in the city, in the town that they're at, your film is talking about your family specifically, but there's moments in the film where they're going through the town and the town is practically empty now because all the younger generations have moved, you know, have moved away. And it is so ironic because I watched a short film for another filmmaker that I'm going to interview by Zoom later today. Her name is Kelly Yu, and she has a short film called Plum Wars. And it's literally about that in China. This young boy, his father has a plum orchard in this countryside, and he moved to the city and has a tech job, and he's like telling his father, leave, why are you still here? And the dad is like, I have to stay here to protect what is ours, you know, like if I leave, who else is going to be here, you know, who's going to protect the house, who's going to protect the orchard? And it's like, it will become a ghost town. And like so when I watched that before I watched your films, I was like, what are the odds? What is happening, right?
Well, I'm so glad that you picked up on all of that and like that you saw that because yes to all of those are all things that they were very intentional and meaningful to me, and I intentionally, I think because I'm a theater artist, didn't explain it. It's not explained in the film. I love that. It's just there, and you guys can do, But what's interesting that you picked up on there is the Chinese characters that he writes at the top of the film is Yunfan. And the Chinese title for me is Yunfan because within the Chinese in China, my family in China, they don't know about the Exclusion Act, right? The title doesn't mean the same thing to them that it means to us. But for me, the Chinese story within it is this thing called Yunfan that I didn't even know about when I started the films. This is again, I have a friend who's a scholar, Margaret Ng, and I was talking to her about all of my research and meeting Helen and our family stories, and she said, "Well, it sounds like you guys are connected through Yunfan." And I was like, "What the heck's that?" So then I had to research it, and you're right. It is commonly used in romantic stories of finding your partner. But the thing that struck me most about it and how I wanted to interpret it within my film is it's just a worldview. It's just the way that the world is, and so you look at your life knowing that is at play, and how does that change you, or how does that allow you to move forward and make your daily choices, right? And before I went to theater school, I did a year of philosophy, so please excuse me if I go into the philosophical, but that I think actually my right hand, my creative consultant on the film, Richard Lee, he knew about Yunfan. Every Chinese person that I spoke to knew about Yunfan. My Chinese students knew about Yunfan, and I was like, can it apply to things that aren't romantic? And they're like, oh yeah. It's just that in fiction, it's often done that way. Yeah. And I started to think about it when we were like running into problems with things like in the making of the film or what. I remember talking to Richard at one point, and I was like, well, like, you know, it just makes me think, like, if I hadn't done, like, or, you know, if Popo hadn't gotten married to Gong Gong, I wouldn't even be here. Like, how can I reconcile these things? And he said, it was about other stuff. It was like in relation to myself. I was like, well, it's like if I hadn't made the film, and he's like, I wouldn't even know the story. And he said, the things that are meant to happen, you would have done it. You would have had the impact. Like, no one can take that away from you. That is your destiny. And you don't know who you're connected to that will allow those moments to happen. You don't even know how they'll manifest, but they will manifest. And you're not in control of it. All you can do is try to stay true to your purpose, right? You were talking about like how you came to be in the job that you're in now. It's that.
Yeah.
And when I teach my students, you know, like I'm not in control. There's no magic anything that I can teach you that will guarantee that you will be a successful actor or theater professional the way that you want to be or the way that you envision it happening now. All I can do is model and inform you and give you some tools to pursue an artistic pathway that's grounded in your own experience in as diverse a way as possible, and encourage you to kind of bring forward your own stories in that way, because that's what I think we as theater artists do, is we bring forward stories. And it's a very collaborative art form, so the more grounded you are in yourself, the more generous you can be to others and invite those stories in and find those connections. And if you do that, maybe you have a chance of being involved in projects that do connect you in different ways through all sort of areas of your life with the forces of the world that are crossing through generations to be able to have these beautiful moments.
Yeah.
But when they happened, like when Helen and I found each other on the graves, it was just ludicrous. Like, it was ludicrous, right? And there's something in the experience of that makes you feel like you belong, that you're in the right place, you're exactly where you should be. And those moments, like feeling those moments in your body are a gift.
Yeah, no, they are, and they happen so few and far in between in life, you know, especially with the way life is now, you know, as I said, like I was telling you before, and it's a story I share with a lot of people, because the way how I came to be doing what I'm doing now as a film critic and a journalist is something I would have never expected 10, 15 years ago. You know, when I moved to Canada, I never envisioned this for myself. It was something that I had always secretly loved to do, because I just love talking about film and all that stuff, but I never believed it could actually happen. But certain steps that I took, you know, eventually led me here. And like, it would seem like, how did me working at volunteering in the emergency room led to me taking a course in paralegal studies, which led to me, like, you know, but the steps happen, and sometimes it is frustrating. You want the steps to be a bit more clear, you know. I want to be able to see the path so that I know that it is going to happen, you know, that so that you know that this thing that I believe is for me will manifest, you know. And I think that's where the frustrating thing comes. And like, as a filmmaker, but also even as an actress and as a writer and like a professor, that you're saying, like, you can't even give your own students those assurances, because you don't have those assurances for yourself. No. You know, and you're just like, that's how it is. That's how life is. And I see film as that way. And I one of the reasons I love talking to filmmakers about documentaries is because documentaries literally is that way. When you start a documentary, you don't know how it's going to end. Yeah. You know, because like, it's like the ending is you don't have a beginning, middle, and end. You know, like the end is yet to be determined. Yeah. And I think that this film, like, the end is yet to be determined, because like, you're now opening a pathway for more people to talk about not only the Exclusion Act and the way it affected generations in the 1920s to the 40s and the 60s for those generations that experienced it, but you're making a pathway for present generations to be able to talk about the past, but also the present. Because with the way Canadian politics is now, we're seeing like our government just started talking about immigration, you know, and like decreasing immigration numbers. And I'm like, watch and see how you're going to suffer, because Canada can't function without immigrants. Yes. You know, and like that, we're starting to see like increments. And
I see it now, like, you know, when your producers and stuff are asking you, like, why now? Why blah, blah, blah. It's not a far leap. Like, I look at the thing that first tipped me off why I wanted to learn more about my own, period of immigration for my family. The Chinese Exclusion Act remains the only legislation that was specifically targeted at an ethnic community, like a national community, a particular race of people. But I started to notice maybe 10 years ago that immigrants, the way that the powers that be in Canada would talk about immigrants, it's as if it's always just first generation.
Right.
And then after that, we're expected to be assimilated to whatever that other thing is, and our ethnicity, our cultural heritage is expected to be less important, not apart from the sort of like nice dances that we get to do.
Because we're supposed to be thankful that we're here in Canada.
My experience of diversity, and I'm very privileged to have this experience, but it's more interesting. It's more complex, and it actually allows you to find connection across difference rather than pretending that you're all the same. So if you make an assumption that we're actually all different, even within the Chinese community we're all different, then we have to talk to each other to figure out where we do share, where we do find those connections, and that becomes what's rewarding. So I think there's something to be said around, like I look for myself at how we're looking at these, decreasing immigration now, and it seems that much more important to really look at the stories of immigration that happened previously, so that the people in power don't make the same mistakes, so that the people who are still traumatized from their own family histories here have compassion. Like, we talked about the silence a lot in the film, and I know that's not just true of the Chinese community. And there was a sort of prevalent push often of like, you have to break the silence, you have to, and I was like,
it's hard, breaking the silence is hard.
And I would actually say, if I look at the behavior of my ancestors, breaking the silence in that kind of way feels potentially disrespectful for them. I need to change my relationship to that silence. I'm not going to accept it anymore. I'm not going to accept it as a glossing over. I'm gonna ask the questions. I'm gonna do the research to see if I can understand it. And I'm gonna see if I can learn both the whys of why that silence was there and what it afforded me as well. There's wisdom in the silence. There's also risk. This is like, you don't want those stories to be lost, and those people are getting older. But there are also ways of speaking to the silence to a diverse audience that might allow them to give their elders who are traumatized from their own immigration stories the space to be able to not speak, so that those of us who can, because we're not as traumatized, have the stories to tell.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I hope, because there's, I think, of any, like I did think of it very generationally, of like, I'm like fourth generation Chinese. It affords me the capacity to speak quite widely, broadly, loudly to these issues, because I'm that much farther removed from them. Those first generation, second generation have other things that they're dealing with to differentiate themselves. The actual relationship between that parent and child is different. It's way easier for grandchildren to look into the stories of their parents, of their grandparents than their parents. Affording that to the newcomers to Canada, I think, is important.
And it's not only that, it's like for me, I'm thinking there's the silence of the older generations, which is understandable, but there's the silence of the younger generations, because they're thinking, oh, that's beyond me, that's in my past, that doesn't affect me. And like when I was watching the film, it made me think of my friend Pearl Lowe. She's an animator. She's Jamaican Chinese heritage, and she's from Vancouver. So she's learning Cantonese now. She moved from Vancouver to LA for her work, but one of the big projects in her life is like learning Cantonese to get back in touch with that aspect of her culture and who she is. And it's also, and she has to think about not being silent about it, because she started like with posting videos on Instagram, but now she has this whole program where she's encouraging other people to learn Cantonese with her. And the film really made me think about, there's the silence of trauma, but then there's the silence of apathy, and I think for a lot of younger generations, and this isn't only with Chinese generations, I think this is with a lot of immigrant generations, I see it a lot with like West Indian and West Indian cultures, and like you say with like Middle Eastern cultures, and Southeast Asian, all of these things, because when you come to particularly North America, and I would say in Europe too, you're expected to be silent in that, not acknowledging how your family came to be and the issues that they faced here. You're expected to think that bad things only happened over there where they came from and not here. So like they have this apathetic attitude towards it. And it's just like, for a lot of people, that's one of the reasons I always talk about being an immigrant, because I'm like, I am proud to be an immigrant, because being an immigrant means that I have survived insurmountable odds. Like, it takes so much courage to uproot your life. Whether you're running from strife or war, whether you're looking for new opportunities, because in Barbados there is literally a ceiling of how much jobs you can get, because it's a small island. But it takes so much courage, it takes so much fortitude, and to build your life in a country like Canada, which is like, there is racism here, there's all this bureaucracy, there's all of these new rules to learn, and like, I remember people still ask, oh, you still have your Bajan accent? I'm like, why would I lose it? Why would I remove that from myself? And I kind of say, and I'm like, and I talk about being an immigrant because I don't want to be silent about that experience, And I also want to encourage other people to talk about being immigrants. Like, there's nothing wrong with being an immigrant. And part of that is because, like, and it's hinted at in the film. Again, you don't really make it explicit, but it's hinted at in the film, where for Chinese immigrants, like, being a Chinese immigrant, the word immigrant has been made a slur in modern day society. Like, you're expected to be ashamed of being an immigrant. Why? And that's, I think that's why you have to be able to, like, talk about these things, make a film about it, because you're encouraging other people. By not in talking about it, you're not being silent anymore, you know?
Exactly.
And in making the film, you're not being silent about it anymore. You're encouraging other people to talk about it. And within the film, Helen spoke about it. She went to China, she spoke to her family. And
she discovered that this language that she thought she could only speak to her grandmother with actually was a gateway to be able to speak to a whole village, 2 villages, my family, better than I could. We were watching the film the other day, and just like, she just comes alive in a different way.
She does.
Because she has the capacity to speak. And I'm kind of like the opposite of like a bit bewildered because I don't have that language. But I can't blame anybody for not having the language. There's very good reasons why that language was cut off. But it will take a lot of work to be able to get it back.
But even if you don't have the language of Cantonese, now you have the language of film, because now they can watch it, and they can understand. Like, you have subtitles, you have people interpreting.
Translation, it's a pretty beautiful thing,
And like, the film is your method of communication, So like, even if you can't speak in Cantonese fluently, like, they can watch the film and they can see the love and care you put towards in creating the film, And I think that's a benefit for them as well. That's a gift to them as well, And that's something that that's the majority of us don't have. Like, I don't have anyone make a film about my life, maybe one day, but that's a way to communicate with them. And I think that's like you said, like, that's the red string of fate in this film, The film is the thread that binds all of these stories together. All of these people together. And I think that's a credit to you, and like, that's a credit to like Helen, accepting the challenge of being a part of the project, like the string may have started with a white man, but, but you were able to make all these connections and I think that's the beauty of it. And now you get to share it at the film festival and get other people involved in talking about it.
And to his credit, like, Craig's wife is from China.
Oh, well,
he has a biracial daughter, and there was also that thing of like, yes, you have a stake in this story because you want to know and make the world, you want to make Canada better for your daughter.
Right.
And that's fair. Koi's experience is very different from my experience because she was born in China at a particular point in time. It's been wonderful to get to know, and she has access to a whole other part of the demographic than I do, and I wouldn't have been able to make the film. Like, I can craft it and do it artistically. I can find the story, and I can speak to my collaborators who are contributing to the artistic shaping of it. Navigating the system of making films made, I would not have been able to do that without. And so it is also about it is also a project for both. It's a project of working across communities, which can be frustrating at times, which is hard. You have to you do have to sort of hold on and know yourself. But I think it's also what we have to do, and it's been really wonderful to have a really diverse team across the board, and we hope that the film finds a really diverse audience as well.
I'm sure it will. Congratulations to you and to Helen.
Thank you.
And to everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time for talking.
It's really lovely to meet you.
Yeah. Great. So thank you so much. Congratulations. I know getting a film at a film festival is not easy. I always want to make sure I say Thank you for getting there. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a real thrill because like once I figured out what the story was, also like the main motivator was to amplify the work that other people have been doing for at least one generation before me through art and through activism to try to dig into this story as well and finding the community. I feel lucky to be within the community that I've found.
Yay. Thank you so much.
Bye.